wind howled through the dense Siberian forest, cutting like a knife against the bare skin. Jack Hartley, a 42-year-old wildlife photographer, had been tracking animal movements for weeks, his camera equipment carefully packed and his survival skills honed from years of wilderness expeditions. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the snow-covered landscape seemed eerily silent. As he adjusted his thermal jacket and checked his GPS coordinates, a sudden movement caught his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow dancing between the snow-laden pine trees. But then he saw her, a massive Siberian tiger, her fur a stunning blend of orange and white, moving with a desperate urgency that was immediately unusual. Something was wrong. Her movements were erratic, almost panicked. Experienced in animal behavior, Jack could sense her distress. She wasn't hunting, wasn't defending territory. She was searching, her head turning rapidly from side to side, her powerful body tense with an emotion that seemed remarkably close to human anxiety. Then he heard it, a faint, desperate mewling sound coming from beneath a fallen tree branch partially buried in snow. The tigress moved with a combination of desperation and maternal instinct that Jack had never witnessed in his decades of wildlife documentation. Her massive paws, normally silent and precise, now scraped urgently against the frozen ground, creating shallow furrows in the snow. What Jack didn't realize immediately was that this wasn't just any tigress. This was a mother who had suffered unimaginable loss. 2 days earlier, poachers had killed her mate and destroyed her original den. The brutal attack had left her vulnerable, her cubs exposed to the merciless Siberian winter, and her survival instincts pushed to their absolute limit. The cubs, 3 of them, barely 2 weeks old, were barely alive. One was wedged under the fallen branch, another lay motionless near a small ice-covered stream, and the third was weakly mewing, its tiny body shivering uncontrollably. Their fur, normally a vibrant orange, was matted and pale, showing signs of severe hypothermia and malnutrition. Jack watched, his professional detachment momentarily shattered. In all his years documenting wildlife, he had never seen such raw, unfiltered maternal desperation. The tigress wasn't just searching, she was making a series of calculated, intelligent decisions. She would nudge one cub, then quickly check on another, her movements precise and purposeful. The environmental conditions were brutal. Temperatures were plummeting to -30 degrees Celsius, and the wind carried ice crystals that could slice through flesh like tiny razors. Any normal animal would have abandoned hope, would have recognized the futility of survival, but not this tigress. Her body told a story of recent struggle. Fresh scars marked her flanks, evidence of the violent encounter with poachers. One ear was slightly torn, and she moved with a slight limp that suggested recent injury. Yet her eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of pure survival instinct. Jack knew the statistics. Siberian tigers were critically endangered. Less than 500 remained in the wild, their population decimated by habitat loss, human encroachment, and relentless poaching. Each cub represented not just a life, but a potential future for an entire species. As he watched, the tigress made a decision that would change everything. She looked directly at Jack, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something that seemed remarkably like a plea. Their eyes locked, a moment of unprecedented communication between human and wild predator. In that instant, Jack understood he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just an animal's struggle for survival. This was a complex narrative of loss, hope, and an almost incomprehensible maternal determination that transcended species boundaries. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of these cubs, but potentially Jack's entire understanding of wildlife, survival, and the intricate connections between humans and the natural world. Jack Harlow wasn't just another wildlife photographer. At 52, he was a seasoned conservationist with over 3 decades of experience in some of the world's most challenging environments. His weathered face told stories of countless expeditions, each line and scar a testament to his deep connection with wilderness. Born in a small logging town in British Columbia, Canada, Jack had always been different from his peers. While other children dreamed of sports or city careers, He was fascinated by the intricate ecosystem surrounding his hometown. His father, a forest ranger, had instilled in him a profound respect for wildlife that went beyond mere observation. When he first spotted the injured tigress and her vulnerable cubs, Jack knew this was no ordinary encounter. His specialized equipment, a high-resolution thermal camera, emergency medical kit, and satellite communication device, suggested this wasn't his first high-stakes wildlife rescue. The Siberian wilderness was unforgiving. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Celsius, and survival depended on split-second decisions. Jack understood the delicate balance between intervention and allowing natural processes to unfold. Years of scientific training had taught him that human interference could sometimes do more harm than good. But this situation was different. The poacher's attack had left more than physical wounds. The tigress's entire social structure had been decimated. Her mate was dead, her den destroyed, and her cubs were on the brink of death. Jack recognized the complex emotional state of the animal, a mixture of grief, protective instinct, and pure survival mechanism. His first move was calculated and slow. He didn't approach directly, understanding that predators perceive sudden movements as threats. Instead, he began creating a subtle perimeter, using techniques he'd learned from indigenous trackers and years of fieldwork. From his backpack, he retrieved specialized warming blankets designed for wildlife rescue. These weren't ordinary blankets, but high-tech thermal devices used by professional conservation teams. Each was lightweight, designed to provide rapid heat without causing thermal shock. The cubs were in critical condition. Hypothermia had already set in, their tiny bodies showing signs of severe metabolic stress. Jack knew he had approximately 45 minutes to stabilize them before permanent damage would occur. His satellite phone crackled to life. A quick call to his colleague, Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, a veterinary specialist in endangered species, confirmed his initial assessment.
Jack, those cubs won't survive without immediate intervention. But be careful. A mother tiger is unpredictable.
The tigress watched his every move. Interestingly, she didn't display typical aggressive behaviors. Her eyes, Jack noted, showed an almost intelligent assessment. It was as if she understood he wasn't a threat. Slowly, methodically, Jack began creating a makeshift shelter. Using a combination of his expedition tent, thermal reflectors, and natural camouflage from surrounding pine branches, he constructed a protected space that would shield the cubs from the brutal wind. His hands moved with practiced precision. Years of wilderness training had made him exceptionally skilled at emergency interventions. He knew that with tigers, every second counted. One wrong move could trigger a defensive response that would doom the entire litter. The cubs were carefully wrapped, their tiny bodies showing minimal movement. Jack's medical training kicked in. He checked their respiratory rates, monitored their core temperatures, and began a delicate warming process. What the tigress did next would become the cornerstone of an extraordinary story. Instead of attacking, she seemed to wait. Her body language shifted from defensive to something resembling cooperation. It was as if she recognized Jack as a potential ally in her desperate fight for survival. Little did Jack know, this moment would mark the beginning of an unprecedented relationship between human and wild predator. A story that would challenge everything known about interspecies communication and survival. The Siberian wilderness held its breath, watching this extraordinary encounter unfold. The first night was a test of pure survival instinct. Jack knew that in the Siberian wilderness, every decision could mean the difference between life and death, not just for the tiger cubs, but for himself as well. The temperature had plummeted to -45 degrees Celsius, a cold so intense it could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Jack's expedition-grade tent, reinforced with specialized thermal insulation, became their only sanctuary. He had strategically positioned it in a small depression between two massive granite outcroppings, using the natural terrain to block the most brutal wind currents. The cubs, barely 3 weeks old, were in critical condition. Their body temperatures were dangerously low, and Jack worked meticulously to stabilize them. He used a combination of specialized warming techniques he'd learned during years of Arctic and subarctic expeditions. Each cub weighed barely 3 kilograms, fragile creatures that represented an entire genetic lineage of Siberian tigers. His medical kit was comprehensive. Developed over years of working in extreme environments, it contained not just standard first aid supplies, but specialized equipment for wildlife rescue, intravenous warming solutions, micro-heating pads designed for infant mammals, and a range of nutritional supplements specifically formulated for big cat cubs. The mother tigress remained close, but not threateningly so. Her behavior was unlike anything Jack had encountered in his 30-year career. She seemed to understand that Jack was their lifeline. Perhaps it was the primal instinct of a mother recognizing an opportunity for her cub's survival, or something more complex that Jack couldn't yet comprehend. Food was the next critical challenge. The cubs needed nutrition, but standard milk formulas wouldn't suffice. Jack had prepared for such scenarios. His pack contained specialized nutritional supplements developed by wildlife conservation researchers, a precise blend of nutrients that mimicked tiger milk's complex composition. Feeding was a delicate process. Using specially designed soft tubes, he carefully administered the nutritional solution. Each cub required individual attention. The smaller of the two was particularly weak, showing signs of severe malnutrition and exposure. Water was another critical concern. While surrounded by snow, finding potable water was crucial. Jack melted snow using a compact solar-powered heating device, carefully filtering it to remove potential contaminants. Hydration was as important as warmth and nutrition. The nights were the most challenging. The darkness brought not just extreme cold, but the constant threat of predators. Jack maintained a careful watch, his years of wilderness training keeping him alert. He had strategically placed motion-activated warning devices around their camp, a combination of sound and light deterrents that would warn off potential threats. The tigress seemed to understand the protection Jack was providing. She would periodically circle the camp, her keen senses alert to any potential danger. It was an unspoken alliance, a cooperation that defied traditional understanding of human-wildlife interactions. Days passed, the cubs slowly grew stronger. Jack documented everything meticulously. Temperature readings, feeding schedules, weight measurements. Each improvement was a small victory against the harsh wilderness. On the fourth day, a severe storm hit. Winds reached speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour, bringing with them a blizzard that reduced visibility to mere meters. Jack's survival skills were pushed to their absolute limit. He reinforced the tent, created additional insulation using emergency thermal blankets, and maintained a constant vigil. The cubs, now slightly stronger, huddled together. Jack used his own body heat when necessary, understanding that sometimes survival required unconventional methods. He had a small, portable generator, carefully rationed fuel, and emergency communication equipment, but knew that in this environment, human technology was secondary to pure survival instinct. Food became increasingly challenging. Jack's own supplies were limited. He had emergency ration packs, high-calorie, nutrient-dense meals designed for extreme environments. But these were meant for human consumption. The cubs required specialized nutrition. He made a difficult decision. Using his extensive knowledge of the local ecosystem, Jack began setting carefully designed traps, not for hunting, but for catching small prey that could be processed into a nutritional source for the cubs. It was a delicate balance between conservation ethics and pure survival. The mother tigress seemed to understand his efforts. She would sometimes bring small prey, dropping them near the camp, a behavior that both fascinated and challenged Jack's understanding of animal behavior. As days turned into a week, the cubs began to show remarkable resilience. Their eyes opened, their bodies grew stronger. Jack knew that each passing hour increased their chances of survival. But survival was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would challenge everything known about human-wildlife interaction. The Siberian wilderness watched, silent and unforgiving, as this unprecedented story of survival continued to unfold. The days following the initial rescue were a testament to Jack's expertise and the cubs' remarkable resilience. Each moment was a delicate dance between life and death, with challenges emerging from every direction. Nutrition became the primary concern. The cubs, orphaned and weak, required a precise balance of nutrients that mimicked their mother's milk. Jack's specialized wildlife nutrition knowledge came into play. He prepared carefully measured formulas, using a combination of scientifically developed supplements and his own carefully crafted mixture. The smaller cub, which Jack mentally nicknamed Shadow, was particularly fragile. Its body weight barely registered on the portable digital scale, and its breathing was shallow and irregular. Jack spent hours monitoring its vital signs, using a miniature veterinary monitoring device he'd brought on previous expeditions. Hydration was equally critical. Jack created a makeshift warming station using his expedition-grade equipment, carefully bringing the cub's body temperatures up gradually. Each drop of water, each ounce of nutrition was carefully measured and administered. The wilderness itself seemed to test their survival. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, from bone-chilling cold to brief moments of relative warmth. Jack's tent became a mobile intensive care unit, with carefully positioned thermal blankets and specialized heating elements. Feeding times were particularly challenging. The cubs required feeding every 2 to 3 hours, a schedule that pushed Jack's endurance to its absolute limits. He developed a systematic approach. One cub fed while the other was kept warm, then switching carefully to ensure both received optimal care. Infection was a constant threat. Jack's medical kit contained a range of antibiotics and preventative medications specifically designed for wildlife rescue. He cleaned and treated the cub's delicate skin, watched for any signs of potential illness, and maintained a sterile environment as much as possible in the harsh wilderness. The mother tigress remained a constant, complex presence. She would occasionally approach the camp, her movements careful and calculated. Jack understood this was not just about territorial behavior, but something more profound: a mother's instinct to ensure her cub's survival. Physical challenges were matched by psychological ones. Jack knew that wildlife rescue was as much about mental endurance as physical skill. He maintained detailed logs, tracked every minute change in the cub's condition, and remained constantly alert. Water sources were carefully selected. Jack used his extensive knowledge of the local ecosystem to find the cleanest, safest water sources. Each drop was filtered multiple times, tested for potential contaminants, and carefully warmed before being used for the cubs. Nutrition came from multiple sources. While his prepared formulas were primary, Jack supplemented with carefully processed local resources. He set small, humane traps to catch small prey, processing them into a nutritional supplement that mimicked the complex dietary needs of tiger cubs. Sleep became a luxury. Jack would take micro-naps, never fully falling asleep, always maintaining a vigilant watch over the cubs. His years of wilderness training had prepared him for such extreme conditions, but this was pushing even his considerable skills to the limit. The cubs slowly began to show signs of improvement. Their eyes, initially sealed shut, began to open. Their movements became more coordinated. Each small improvement was a victory against the harsh wilderness that surrounded them. As days turned into weeks, Jack discovered that survival was only the beginning of his extraordinary journey with the tiger cubs. What started as a professional rescue mission gradually transformed into something far more profound and deeply personal. The cubs, initially fragile and dependent, began to develop distinct personalities. The smaller cub, Shadow, remained cautious and reserved, while the larger one, whom Jack started calling Striker, displayed an unexpected curiosity and boldness that both surprised and delighted him. During quiet moments, Jack would observe the cubs with a mixture of scientific detachment and growing emotional attachment. He recognized the danger of anthropomorphizing wild animals, yet he couldn't deny the unique bond developing between them. Striker would often approach him during feeding times, making soft, chirping sounds that seemed more like communication than simple animal vocalization. One particularly challenging night, when temperatures dropped dramatically, Jack found himself sharing body heat with the cubs, wrapped in thermal blankets, with the two small bodies nestled against his chest. He realized this was far more than a typical wildlife rescue. The cubs seemed to sense his protective instinct, their breathing synchronized with his own. Jack's background as a wildlife biologist and conservation expert had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing could have readied him for the emotional complexity of raising these orphaned cubs. He documented every interaction, every behavioral nuance, understanding that this was an unprecedented opportunity to study tiger cub development in an intimate, hands-on manner. Stryker began showing remarkable intelligence early on. The cub would watch Jack's movements intently, mimicking certain actions and displaying an almost uncanny ability to understand basic commands. Jack implemented a careful training approach, ensuring he didn't domesticate the cubs, but instead prepared them for eventual return to their natural habitat. The emotional connection grew more complex with each passing day. Jack found himself talking to the cubs, sharing stories of his previous wildlife expeditions, his conservation work, and his personal struggles. Shadow, the more reserved cub, would listen intently, while Stryker would often playfully bat at Jack's hands or clothing. Nutrition became more than just a survival strategy. Jack developed a sophisticated feeding and care routine that mimicked natural tiger cub development. He created obstacle courses within the safe confines of their wilderness camp, encouraging physical development and natural hunting instincts. Communication became a fascinating study. Jack noticed subtle changes in the cubs' vocalizations, different sounds for hunger, discomfort, playfulness, and what seemed like genuine attempts to interact. He began recording these sounds, knowing they could be valuable for future wildlife research. The wilderness became their shared classroom. Jack would take the cubs on carefully monitored exploration trips, teaching them about their environment. He showed them how to navigate terrain, identify potential food sources, and recognize potential threats. These expeditions were as much about their survival education as they were about building trust. Emotional bonding occurred in unexpected moments. During thunderstorms, the cubs would huddle close to Jack, seeking comfort and protection. He would softly speak to them, his voice a calming presence amidst the wild's unpredictability. These moments challenged everything Jack knew about human-wildlife interactions. Physical care became an intricate dance of professional expertise and genuine affection. Jack developed specialized massage techniques to help the cubs' muscle development, used carefully selected natural oils to maintain their coat health, and created custom enrichment activities that stimulated their mental and physical growth. As weeks passed, Jack realized he was no longer just a rescuer or a scientist. He had become something more, a guardian, a teacher, and in many ways a surrogate parent to these remarkable creatures. The line between professional observation and emotional connection blurred increasingly. The cubs' growing strength and independence became a bittersweet reminder of the ultimate goal, their return to the wild. Jack knew that true conservation meant preparing them for a life beyond human intervention. Each milestone in their development was both a celebration and a subtle preparation for eventual separation. By the time 2 months had passed, Jack understood that this experience was transforming him as much as he was guiding the cubs' development. The unexpected connection had become a profound journey of mutual understanding, respect, and an almost inexplicable bond that transcended traditional boundaries between humans and wildlife. The rescue and rehabilitation process began on a crisp, unforgiving morning in the remote wilderness of northern India's Tiger Corridor. Jack Harrington, a seasoned wildlife conservation expert with over 2 decades of experience, had received an urgent call from local forest rangers about a critically endangered tiger situation. The circumstances were dire. A female tiger had been critically injured during a territorial dispute, leaving her 2 young cubs vulnerable and alone. Preliminary reports suggested the mother had sustained severe wounds that would likely prove fatal. The local wildlife team knew that without immediate intervention, the cubs would not survive more than a few days in the harsh wilderness. Jack's reputation preceded him. He had developed a unique approach to wildlife rehabilitation that went far beyond traditional conservation methods. His work had been featured in multiple international wildlife journals, and he was known for his extraordinary success in reintegrating orphaned predators back into their natural habitats. The initial rescue was fraught with challenges. Accessing the remote location required a combination of rugged jeep travel and hours of trekking through dense forest terrain. Jack carried specialized equipment, portable incubators, nutrient-rich formula designed specifically for tiger cubs, medical supplies, and tracking devices that would allow continuous monitoring of the cubs' health and development. Upon reaching the site, Jack discovered the cubs in a precarious state. They were approximately 6 weeks old, significantly underweight, and showing signs of severe malnutrition and exposure. The smaller cub, barely clinging to life, had multiple minor injuries that required immediate medical attention. The larger cub displayed more resilience but was clearly traumatized by the loss of its mother. The initial medical assessment was comprehensive. Jack worked meticulously, using a portable veterinary kit to conduct a thorough examination. Blood tests, body temperature monitoring, and careful physical inspection revealed the extent of their vulnerability. The cubs were suffering from dehydration, mild hypothermia, and the psychological trauma of losing their mother. Immediate stabilization became the primary concern. Jack created a makeshift shelter using specialized thermal blankets and portable equipment. The cubs were carefully wrapped, their body temperatures gradually brought to optimal levels. Specialized formula, developed through years of research, was administered carefully to prevent further stress. The first 72 hours were critical. Jack maintained a constant vigil, monitoring the cubs' vital signs every hour. He established a precise feeding schedule, understanding that tiger cubs require specific nutritional interventions at different developmental stages. Each feeding was a delicate process, requiring extreme patience and expertise. Rehabilitation wasn't just about physical recovery. Jack implemented a comprehensive approach that addressed both physical and psychological needs. He created a controlled environment that mimicked natural tiger habitat conditions, while providing necessary medical support. Specialized enrichment activities were designed to stimulate the cubs' natural instincts and developmental processes. Communication became a crucial aspect of the rehabilitation process. Jack used a combination of soft vocalizations, careful body language, and strategic interactions to build trust. He understood that successful rehabilitation required more than medical intervention. It needed a holistic approach that respected the cub's wild nature while providing necessary support. Nutritional rehabilitation was particularly challenging. Jack developed a custom diet plan that gradually transitioned the cubs from specialized formula to more solid food sources. He incorporated techniques that would help them develop hunting skills, using carefully designed training methods that didn't compromise their wild instincts. Medical challenges were numerous. The smaller cub developed a respiratory infection that required intensive care. Jack worked tirelessly, administering specialized antibiotics, creating humidity-controlled environments, and monitoring the cub's progress with scientific precision. Sleepless nights became the norm, with Jack maintaining a constant watch over his vulnerable charges. The rehabilitation site was carefully chosen, a remote location that provided both protection and opportunities for natural development. Jack set up a complex system of protected zones that allowed the cubs increasing levels of independence while maintaining a safety net of human intervention. Psychological rehabilitation was equally important. Jack implemented carefully designed protocols that would help the cubs develop natural survival skills. This included creating obstacle courses that mimic natural terrain, introducing controlled hunting simulations, and gradually reducing direct human interaction. Documentation became a critical component of the process. Jack maintained extensive logs, recording every medical intervention, behavioral change, and developmental milestone. His meticulous approach turned the rescue into a potential breakthrough in understanding tiger cub rehabilitation. As weeks passed, the transformation became increasingly evident. The cubs, once fragile and dependent, began showing remarkable signs of recovery and development. Their physical strength improved, natural instincts emerged, and they started displaying the complex behaviors characteristic of young tigers. Jack's approach was revolutionary. Unlike traditional wildlife rehabilitation methods that focus solely on medical intervention, his process integrated psychological support, environmental adaptation, and a deep understanding of tiger behavior. Each day brought new challenges and unexpected moments of connection. The rehabilitation process was more than a scientific endeavor. It was a profound journey of survival, adaptation, and hope. Jack understood that he was not just saving 2 individual cubs, but potentially contributing to the conservation of an entire endangered species. By the 2-month mark, the cubs had transformed from vulnerable orphans to resilient, developing predators. The foundation had been laid for their eventual return to the wild, a journey that would require continued support, careful monitoring, and an unwavering commitment to their survival. The transition from controlled rehabilitation to wilderness adaptation was a meticulously planned and executed process that would test both the cubs' resilience and Jack Harrington's expertise. The extreme environment of the northern Indian wilderness presented challenges that went far beyond typical wildlife reintegration protocols. The selected reintegration zone was a carefully chosen 500 square kilometer protected corridor that offered a complex ecosystem of dense forests, rocky terrain, and multiple water sources. This region represented a microcosm of the challenges wild tigers would face, with varying temperature ranges from near-freezing nights to scorching daytime heat that could exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Jack's approach began with a gradual exposure strategy. The cubs, now nearly 4 months old, were introduced to increasingly challenging environmental conditions through a series of controlled interventions. Custom-designed protective gear helped monitor their physiological responses while allowing maximum natural adaptation. The first phase of environmental adaptation focused on temperature regulation. Tigers are remarkably adaptable creatures, but these cubs had experienced significant trauma and controlled rehabilitation. Jack created a series of graduated exposure zones that allowed them to experience temperature variations incrementally. Thermal tracking devices monitored their body temperature, metabolic responses, and stress levels during each exposure. Terrain adaptation became a critical component of their survival training. The rocky, uneven landscape of the wilderness corridor was dramatically different from the controlled rehabilitation environment. Jack designed complex obstacle courses that mimicked natural terrain, incorporating fallen logs, steep inclines, rocky outcroppings, and dense vegetation. Hunting simulation was perhaps the most crucial aspect of their adaptation. Unlike captive bred animals, these cubs needed to develop precise predatory skills that would ensure their survival. Jack implemented a multi-stage training program that began with controlled hunting scenarios and gradually increased in complexity. The first hunting simulations used carefully prepared prey surrogates, initially stationary targets that mimicked the movement and thermal signatures of small prey animals. As the cubs developed skills, these simulations became increasingly dynamic. Jack used advanced tracking technology and remote-controlled mechanisms to create realistic hunting scenarios. Water adaptation presented unique challenges. Tigers are exceptional swimmers, but these cubs needed to develop confidence in various aquatic environments. Jack identified several water sources within the rehabilitation corridor, from slow-moving streams to more challenging river sections with varying currents. Initial water training began in controlled pools with carefully managed depth and current. The cubs were introduced to water through positive reinforcement techniques, using a combination of food rewards and carefully managed exposure. Jack's approach emphasized building confidence rather than forcing interaction. Dietary adaptation was equally complex. The specialized formula used during rehabilitation was gradually replaced with a diet that more closely mimicked wild hunting patterns. Jack worked with local wildlife experts to source appropriate prey animals that would help the cubs develop natural hunting skills. The psychological aspects of environmental adaptation were perhaps the most nuanced. Tigers are solitary predators with complex behavioral patterns, and these cubs needed to develop independence while maintaining the survival skills learned during rehabilitation. Jack implemented a gradual reduction of human interaction, creating scenarios that encouraged natural behavior while maintaining a safety net of observation. Weather adaptation became a critical focus. The wilderness corridor experienced extreme seasonal variations, from monsoon periods with heavy rainfall to dry seasons with minimal water sources. The cubs needed to develop strategies for shelter, temperature regulation, and resource management. Jack developed a series of environmental challenges that tested the cubs' adaptability. These included simulated scenarios that mimicked potential survival challenges, sudden temperature drops, limited food sources, and encounters with potential predators or competing wildlife. Tracking technology played a crucial role in the adaptation process. Custom-designed GPS and biometric tracking devices allowed Jack and his team to monitor the cubs' movements, physiological responses, and behavioral patterns without direct intervention. These devices provided unprecedented insights into their adaptation process. The psychological bond between the cubs remained a fascinating aspect of their development. Despite being from the same litter, they displayed distinct personalities and adaptation strategies. The larger cub showed more aggressive exploration tendencies, while the smaller cub demonstrated more cautious but equally determined survival instincts. As months passed, the transformation became increasingly evident. The cubs, once dependent on human intervention, were developing the complex skills necessary for wilderness survival. Their physical capabilities expanded dramatically, muscle mass increased, hunting skills became more refined, and their understanding of the environment grew exponentially. Challenges were constant and unpredictable. A particularly challenging period came during the monsoon season when heavy rainfall created treacherous terrain conditions. The cubs demonstrated remarkable adaptability, finding shelter in natural rock formations and managing their body temperature with instinctive precision. Jack's approach was revolutionary in wildlife conservation circles. Traditional rehabilitation methods often failed to prepare animals for the complex realities of wilderness survival. His comprehensive adaptation strategy represented a significant breakthrough in understanding how traumatized wildlife could be successfully reintegrated into their natural habitat. By the 8-month mark, the cubs had transformed from vulnerable orphans to potential apex predators. Their adaptation was not just a physical process, but a complex journey of survival, instinct, and resilience. They represented more than individual animals. They were a testament to the extraordinary potential of wildlife conservation when approached with scientific precision and deep ecological understanding. The final stages of adaptation would prove to be the most critical, the point where human intervention would need to be completely withdrawn, allowing the cubs to become truly wild. Jack knew that this moment would be the ultimate test of their rehabilitation and adaptation process. The rescue of the tiger cubs had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond Jack Harrington's initial intervention. What began as a seemingly isolated incident of wildlife preservation gradually transformed into a landmark case that would reshape conservation efforts across the Indian subcontinent. 5 years after the initial rescue, the 2 cubs, now fully grown tigers, had become subjects of intense scientific study. Their unique background of human intervention and wilderness adaptation provided researchers with unprecedented insights into tiger rehabilitation and survival strategies. Jack's detailed documentation of their journey became a cornerstone of wildlife conservation research. Academic institutions worldwide began studying the comprehensive approach he had developed, challenging traditional methods of wildlife rehabilitation. His methodology demonstrated that human intervention, when executed with scientific precision, could successfully reintegrate traumatized wildlife into their natural habitats. The tigers, tracked through advanced GPS and biometric monitoring systems, had established separate territories within the protected wildlife corridor. Remarkably, they had not only survived but thrived, demonstrating exceptional hunting skills and reproductive potential. The female had successfully given birth to 2 cubs, proving that their rehabilitation had not compromised their natural breeding capabilities. Local wildlife authorities, initially skeptical of Jack's approach, now viewed his work as a breakthrough in conservation techniques. The Indian Forest Department began incorporating elements of his rehabilitation strategy into their standard wildlife management protocols. What was once considered an experimental approach was now becoming mainstream conservation practice. Economic implications emerged unexpectedly. The success of the tiger rehabilitation project attracted international research funding and ecological tourism interest. The specific wildlife corridor where the cubs were reintegrated became a focal point for conservation studies, bringing significant economic benefits to the surrounding rural communities. Jack's personal life underwent dramatic transformations as well. His reputation in wildlife conservation circles grew exponentially. International wildlife organizations sought his expertise, and he was invited to develop rehabilitation strategies in multiple countries facing similar wildlife preservation challenges. The genetic tracking of the rehabilitated tigers revealed additional fascinating insights. Their unique background provided researchers with critical data about genetic adaptability, survival mechanisms, and the long-term impacts of human intervention in wildlife rehabilitation. Perhaps most significantly, the story of these cubs became a powerful narrative about human-wildlife coexistence. It challenged existing perceptions about the limitations of wildlife conservation and demonstrated the potential for compassionate, scientifically rigorous intervention. The local community where the rescue originally occurred underwent its own transformation. What was once an area with limited wildlife conservation awareness became a model of community-driven ecological preservation. Local residents, inspired by the cub's story, became active participants in wildlife protection efforts. As the years passed, the rescue became more than just an isolated incident. It represented a pivotal moment in understanding the complex relationship between human intervention and natural wildlife survival mechanisms. Jack Harrington had done more than save 2 tiger cubs. He had opened a new chapter in conservation science. The impact of Jack Harrington's unprecedented tiger cub rescue reverberated through the global wildlife conservation landscape, creating ripples of change that would be felt for decades to come. His approach challenged fundamental assumptions about human intervention in wildlife preservation, sparking intense debates and transformative research across multiple continents. International conservation organizations began to reassess their traditional methodologies after studying the detailed documentation of Jack's rescue and rehabilitation process. The comprehensive approach he had developed went far beyond simple wildlife rescue. It represented a holistic model of ecological intervention that considered the complex psychological and physiological needs of traumatized animals. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a leading wildlife behavioral scientist from the University of Sao Paulo, spent 2 years studying the documentation and tracking data from Jack's rescued tigers. Her groundbreaking research revealed that the cubs' successful reintegration was not just a matter of chance, but a result of meticulously planned intervention that respected both the animals' natural instincts and their unique traumatic background. The research highlighted several critical innovations in wildlife conservation. Traditional approaches often viewed human intervention as a last resort, typically focusing on minimal contact and rapid release. Jack's method demonstrated that carefully managed human interaction could actually enhance an animal's survival potential, particularly in cases of extreme environmental stress or maternal loss. Funding dynamics within conservation circles began to shift. Major international grants started prioritizing research that incorporated Jack's adaptive rehabilitation strategies. The World Wildlife Fund established a special research grant named after him, supporting projects that explored innovative approaches to wildlife preservation and human-animal interaction. In India, the National Wildlife Protection Framework underwent significant modifications. The forest departments across multiple states began implementing training programs that incorporated Jack's methodological insights. These programs emphasized a more nuanced understanding of wildlife rehabilitation, moving away from rigid, one-size-fits-all approaches. The economic implications were equally profound. Wildlife tourism in the regions where Jack's research was conducted saw a substantial increase. Researchers, conservationists, and wildlife enthusiasts from around the world began visiting these areas, bringing economic opportunities to rural communities that had previously been marginalized. Technological innovation became another unexpected outcome. The tracking and monitoring techniques developed during the tiger cub research led to advancements in wildlife tracking technology. GPS systems became more sophisticated, allowing for more precise and less invasive monitoring of endangered species. Indigenous communities, traditionally viewed as peripheral to conservation efforts, found themselves at the center of new preservation strategies. Jack's work emphasized the critical role of local knowledge and community involvement in wildlife conservation. This approach recognized that effective preservation was not about creating barriers between humans and wildlife, but about developing sustainable coexistence models. Academic institutions worldwide began developing specialized courses and research programs inspired by the comprehensive approach demonstrated in Jack's work. Universities in India, the United States, Brazil, and several European countries introduced new curriculum modules focusing on adaptive wildlife rehabilitation strategies. The psychological aspects of wildlife preservation gained unprecedented attention. Researchers began exploring the complex emotional and developmental impacts of trauma on wild animals, challenging previous assumptions about animal resilience and adaptation. Environmental policymakers started incorporating more nuanced perspectives into wildlife protection legislation. The rigid, punitive approaches of the past gave way to more flexible, science-driven conservation strategies that recognized the intricate balance between human activity and wildlife preservation. Perhaps most significantly, the story of the tiger cubs became a powerful narrative that captured public imagination. It transformed public perception about wildlife conservation from a distant academic pursuit to a dynamic, emotionally engaging field of human endeavor. Jack Harrington had inadvertently created a new paradigm in wildlife conservation. His work was not just about saving 2 tiger cubs, it represented a fundamental reimagining of human-wildlife interaction. The boundaries between scientific intervention and compassionate preservation had been redrawn, offering a more holistic, empathetic approach to understanding and protecting the natural world. As global ecological challenges became increasingly complex, the lessons learned from this remarkable rescue would continue to inspire and guide conservation efforts around the world, proving that sometimes the most profound scientific breakthroughs emerged from moments of unexpected compassion and human connection. Jack Harrington stared out the window of his modest research cabin, the weight of his recent experiences etched deeply into the lines of his weathered face. The tiger cubs' rescue had been more than just a wildlife conservation project. It had become a profound personal journey of transformation that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself, his career, and his purpose. 20 years earlier, Jack had been a different man, a high-powered wildlife documentary filmmaker with a reputation for capturing the most dangerous and remote environments on the planet. He had been driven by an insatiable desire for professional recognition. His work had taken him to the most treacherous corners of the world, but he had always maintained a clinical, detached approach. Animals were subjects, stories were commodities, and success was measured in awards and network contracts. The encounter with the tigress and her cubs had shattered that carefully constructed professional persona. What had begun as a routine documentary expedition in the dense forests of central India had become a life-altering experience that would redefine his entire understanding of connection, survival, and human-animal relationships. As he reflected on the journey, Jack remembered the moment everything changed. It wasn't the dramatic rescue itself, but the weeks and months that followed. The painstaking process of rehabilitation, the intricate dance of trust building, and the profound emotional bond that developed between him and the orphaned cubs. His professional network had been skeptical, even dismissive. Colleagues in wildlife documentary production viewed his approach as unconventional, bordering on unprofessional.
You're not a wildlife rehabilitator.
They would say.
You're a filmmaker. Stay in your lane.
But Jack had long since stopped listening to their narrow-minded perspectives. The research and documentation he compiled during the cubs' rehabilitation became something far more significant than a mere documentary project. It was a comprehensive study that challenged existing paradigms in wildlife conservation, animal psychology, and interspecies communication. Dr. Miranda Chen, a a renowned behavioral ecologist from the University of California, had been the first academic to recognize the groundbreaking nature of his work. Her endorsement had been a turning point, lending scientific credibility to what many had initially dismissed as an emotional amateur endeavor. Jack's professional transformation wasn't just about changing his approach to wildlife documentation. It represented a deeper, more personal metamorphosis. The experience with the tiger cubs had stripped away his professional armor, revealing vulnerabilities and emotional depths he had long suppressed. His financial investments shifted dramatically. The lucrative contracts with major networks were replaced by research grants and collaborative projects focused on innovative conservation strategies. He sold his expensive camera equipment and invested in tracking technologies, rehabilitation resources, and community engagement programs. The personal revelations were equally profound. Jack discovered that his previous life, filled with awards, international recognition, and superficial achievements, had been a carefully constructed facade. The true meaning of his work lay not in capturing dramatic footage, but in creating meaningful, transformative connections. His relationships changed too. The colleagues who had once celebrated his high-profile documentaries now viewed him with a mixture of confusion and mild contempt. But a new network emerged. Passionate conservationists, indigenous community leaders, and researchers who saw the deeper value in his approach. The tiger cub story became more than a personal project. It evolved into a movement, inspiring a new generation of wildlife researchers and conservationists who understood that true preservation was about empathy, understanding, and holistic engagement. Financial challenges were constant. Traditional funding sources dried up, and Jack found himself constantly navigating complex grant applications and research proposals. But each challenge reinforced his commitment to the work that had transformed his life. International recognition came unexpectedly. A documentary about his journey with the tiger cubs won several prestigious awards, not for its cinematographic brilliance, but for its profound narrative of connection and survival. Jack found himself speaking at international conferences, not as a filmmaker, but as a pioneering researcher who had fundamentally reimagined human-wildlife interaction. The cubs themselves became ambassadors of a new conservation philosophy. Carefully tracked and monitored, they represented living proof of the potential for successful rehabilitation and interspecies understanding. Jack's personal life underwent a similar transformation. The driven, often isolated filmmaker became a community-engaged researcher, deeply connected to the local ecosystems and indigenous communities where he worked. His home became a research center, his personal space blending seamlessly with his professional mission. As the years passed, Jack realized that the true value of his work wasn't in the dramatic rescue or the subsequent research. It was in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in perspective. The growing understanding that conservation was not about controlling or studying nature, but about developing a profound, respectful relationship with the complex ecosystems that sustain life. The tiger cubs had given him far more than a professional breakthrough. They had offered him a new way of seeing the world, a perspective of interconnectedness, empathy, and humble recognition of the intricate web of life that connects all living beings. 20 years after the remarkable rescue of the tiger cubs, Jack Harrington's life had become a testament to the transformative power of compassion and perseverance. The final chapter of his extraordinary journey was about to unfold in ways he could never have anticipated. The two cubs he had rescued, now fully grown tigers named Sita and Raja, had become the cornerstone of a groundbreaking conservation program that extended far beyond traditional wildlife management. What had begun as a personal mission had evolved into a comprehensive approach to wildlife preservation that was changing the landscape of conservation worldwide. The remote research centre Jack had established in the heart of central India had grown into a beacon of hope for endangered species. Nestled against the backdrop of dense forests and rolling hills, the facility was more than just a research station. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of collaboration, learning, and mutual respect between humans and wildlife. Government officials from multiple countries had begun to take notice. What was once considered a radical approach to wildlife conservation was now being studied and implemented in conservation zones across Asia and Africa. Jack's methodology, which emphasized long-term rehabilitation, community involvement, and holistic ecosystem management, was revolutionizing how humans interacted with endangered species. Sita and Raja were more than just success stories. They had become the genetic founders of a carefully managed breeding program that had already helped increase the tiger population in the region by 37%. Their offspring were carefully tracked, monitored, and integrated into protected habitats, creating a sustainable model of wildlife preservation that balanced scientific rigor with deep ecological understanding. But the true impact of Jack's work extended far beyond the tigers themselves. The local indigenous communities, who'd once been marginalized and viewed as obstacles to conservation, were now active partners in the preservation efforts. The research center had become an economic and educational hub, providing jobs, training, and opportunities for local populations. A breakthrough came on a crisp morning when Dr. Miranda Chen arrived with a team of international researchers. They had compiled comprehensive data that would change everything. The genetic tracking of Sita and Raja's lineage revealed something extraordinary. The cubs' survival and subsequent breeding had not just impacted the local tiger population, but had created a genetic diversity that could potentially save the entire species from the brink of extinction. The financial implications were massive. Major conservation organizations and government agencies began competing for partnerships with Jack's research center. Funding that was once a constant struggle now flowed freely. But Jack remained committed to his original vision. This was never about money or recognition. Personal challenges had been numerous. Jack's unconventional approach had alienated many of his original colleagues in wildlife documentation. His marriage had ended during the early years of his research, a casualty of his single-minded dedication to the tiger's survival. But he had found a different kind of family, a global network of researchers, conservationists, and local community members who shared his vision. The most profound moment came during an international conference in New Delhi. Jack, now in his late 60s, stood before a packed auditorium of the world's leading conservationists, wildlife experts, and policymakers. His presentation was not about achievements or accolades, but about a fundamental reimagining of human-wildlife relationships.
We are not separate from nature,
he told the audience, his voice steady and passionate.
We are part of an intricate, interconnected system. The survival of a species is not about preservation in isolation, but about understanding, respect, and coexistence.
The conference marked a turning point. Policies began to change. Countries that had previously viewed wildlife conservation as a secondary concern now started implementing comprehensive protection strategies based on Jack's research. But the most significant transformation was happening on the ground. The research center had become a model of sustainable conservation. Local communities were now trained as wildlife monitors, researchers, and protectors. Children who had once viewed tigers as a threat now understood them as crucial components of their ecosystem. Sita and Raja, now in their prime, continued to play a crucial role. Their genetic legacy was carefully managed, but they were more than just breeding stock. They were living symbols of the possibility of coexistence, of hope, of the extraordinary potential that emerges when humans approach nature with humility and respect. Jack's personal life had found a different kind of fulfillment. He was surrounded by a chosen family of researchers, local community members, and wildlife experts who shared his vision. His small cabin, once a solitary research outpost, was now a vibrant hub of activity, filled with the sounds of research discussions, community meetings, and the occasional distant roar of tigers. As the sun set over the research center, casting long shadows across the landscape that had been transformed by 2 rescued cubs and one man's unwavering commitment, Jack reflected on the journey. What had begun as a moment of instinctive intervention had become a global movement. The tigers had given him everything: a purpose, a mission, a way of understanding the world that transcended traditional boundaries. And in return, he he had given them something equally precious, a chance to survive, to thrive, to continue their ancient dance of existence in a world increasingly dominated by human intervention. The final resolution was not an endpoint, but a continuous journey of discovery, respect, and hope.